You saw Sim Lim coming from Singapore as a digital bank. What resonates between the two of you, by the way? Some of the products that you see out there, what are you developing now that would have influence on him?
Well, there was a lot of resonance. I think how they and he have built DBS so quickly into a digital bank is actually extraordinary. And he talked about APIs. We spend a lot of time on APIs, these application programming interfaces. Think of it as the next generation connective tissue that we see in enterprise technology, we see in fintech, kind of all of the above. And the fact that they were able to marshal that to create that. One of my favorite anecdotes, because we spend a lot of time in fintech in addition to other areas, is this company we invested called Plaid, which is one of the leading fintech infrastructure companies. 10 years ago at their first pitch, they had a landing page of a regular bank. I won't mention the name of the bank. And then they clicked to the next slide, and it was the same bank with all of the products and services that fintech is disrupting. And it was 97. It was payments, it was digital banking, it was corporate banking, it was lending. Just every single, if you think about it, just think about your bank's homepage, every single tab, fintech is disrupting, and there's a whole host of companies doing that. So I just found that really interesting and fascinating with how Sim was able to transform DBS into a digital bank.
Yeah, it's interesting. What influence will your work today have on the digital bank of the future, would you say, in terms of interface?
I think that it's a lot of the building blocks. So as we think about investing, a big tenet we stick to is called product market fit. And product market fit is what really drives us as venture capitalists, which is what does the market need and what is the product such that without which you can't survive. One of my mentors mentioned that to me as a good definition. So whether it is lending, whether it's these APIs, whether it's B2B payments, for example, we've done a lot in B2C payments, business to consumer. B2B payments, it's a multi-trillion-dollar set of industries, not just one industry, set of industries that's still arcane. And so our companies are really the building blocks that if you think about all of them getting disrupted, they can all be pieces of a digital bank's offering, in addition to what's called neobanks, which are de novo banks that were started just for that express purpose of being digital first.
You were saying something interesting to me on the phone when we chatted, that we're only getting started with disruption. So why don't you share with this audience, because that's one of the things we try to do at the World Government Summit, is to kind of give a sight into the future. We have an AI minister, a minister of the future here in the UAE. What's the future look like with disruption and what you're investing in? Well,
obviously I'm biased. I've been a venture capitalist for 22 years. And I think a great window into the only getting started was really the pandemic. If you thought about the pandemic, there was this initial shock, at least this is in the US, and I think it's pretty similar globally. This initial shock, what is this going to mean for society, humanity? There's some broader, deeper implications. But what it did do is it shined a very bright light on innovation, disruption, digitization. Massive industries that were dealing with pen and paper, services, spreadsheets, very inefficient ways of doing business, wholesale accelerated their digital plans. They maybe have had a 5 to 10 year window or a 10 to 20 year window. It was more 12 to 36 months.
Wow.
So what's happening now is the disruption, we're just getting started because it was also before, if you look at least how I thought about it from Silicon Valley, the start of venture capital as we know it, you can trace it to 40, 50, 60, 70 years, whether it's Intel really getting started or Hewlett Packard. But now this disruption is global. So one area we invest in, example, we invest in a lot in enterprise technology, this whole open source movement, which is really a collection of developers. It could be all of us in a room, starting with a protocol that does something so unique. But so we've financed multi-billion-dollar companies out of the Nordics, Amsterdam, Latin America. It is really global. So that disruption is becoming pervasive, and you're seeing pockets of it. Before it was very much localized Silicon Valley. And then it started broadening. Now it really is global. So that's really fun to watch and be a part of.
Good. What are you investing in now? What's hot and why are you over here?
Yeah, it's a good question. So our firm, NewView Capital, we're a little over 3 years old. We're a little over $2 billion under management. We invest mid to later stage growth equity in two broad areas: enterprise technology, predominantly software, and fintech, although we do some other things as well. And for us, there's enterprise technology, think of software as a service, so Salesforce, it's a company pretty well known. you could argue they kind of started the software as a service. So instead of, before, decades ago, you would get software mailed to you and you'd insert it and it would just be on your computer or your servers, that has been blown up, right? So that company is 20 years old, we would still call that the early days of B2B enterprise software. So there is, whether it's health tech, the healthcare industry, fintech, insurance tech, like all of these areas that used to be moribund industries with not a lot of disruption and innovation, they're getting digitized. So that's one big area. Oh. I think fintech, I mean, we've talked about that a lot. And where we really play is once we see evidence of product market fit, it's a fragile part in a company's existence because they're still losing money, but they need more money to really hyperscale. And a lot of that, I love what Sim said about what was the secret to DBS, just his team and his leadership, is really taking the products that have passed product market fit, pouring in capital, and building management teams. That was a localized thing, and now it's very global in how we've thought about it.
What would you say that the UAE needs to go to the next level? Because I know there's an incredible engagement when it comes to fintech at this stage.
Yeah, I think that you know, the advantage that the United States had was really, you're right, the role of universities, national labs, are all government funded, and government-funded universities. So if you really thought about the 50s, 60s, 70s, for example, the semiconductor revolution, the internet revolution really developed the University of Illinois. It was a lot of this government funding that really resulted in robust research being done at these labs and universities, and you had enterprising professors really that said, you know what, I want to start a company with that. So that started 50, 60 years ago. It started obviously in Silicon Valley. There was pockets in New England, Toronto, there's all these pockets emerging. And then that spawned these companies, and then that was only the beginning. What happened is you needed some success stories with these companies, right? Google, a great example, and others. So I think UAE, just like a lot of these other economies, I talked about Singapore has done a great job. The role that the government can play in funding this research, because research funding it is actually a pretty unprofitable entity, right? Because it takes capital and it takes a long while for it to get to fruition. But the more that can happen, in addition to these public-private partnerships that people talk about, that can really start that progression. This whole, whether it's UAE or MENA broadly, you've already seen successes, and you need more of those successes to put it on the map that can attract capital, talent, and companies, and that actually has this virtuous cycle that we've seen in a number of other geographies globally. Good.
What is the role of a unicorn, out of curiosity? What is the brand that it creates for a country? Now, for example, we had Souk.com here was a local player. It was the first major unicorn. It was picked up by, of course, by Jeff Bezos over time. But how does that fit into something that could also be scalable? Because that was a regional play at the same time, right?
Yeah. I think you just need some of those successes just by virtue of the fact that they exist in a local geography. And the main reason you want that is for the companies, yes, but really the people around, the ecosystem in that geography to say, it is okay for me to take a risk, leave my job that my parents have been in for 20, 30 years and venture into something that is highly risky, unprofitable, unsure of success. But you can point to some of these, every one of these geographies. I mean, the best example, I think, in the last 20, 30 years outside the US is in China. If you look at Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, what that has done for the Chinese venture capital market is pretty massive. So you need more Souk.coms, but you need the transformation of some of these to be global. First it's local, then it's regional, then it's global. The more you have that, then you have, again, this virtuous cycle where it keeps happening, and then it just becomes a center of excellence. The unicorn phenomena is great, certainly for the employees and the founders who work really hard, sacrifice. I think that phenomena is far more pervasive and far more powerful for that ecosystem, because it actually tells people we belong, we're now on the map, and we can actually do this, not just this very small percentage of the people.
Okay. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about is what impact the pandemic had on the visibility of Dubai. I'd love to hear your views from a Silicon Valley perspective, because you obviously came here for a reason, right?
Yeah.
And you wanted to get a taste of what's taking place on the ground right now. what influence has the pandemic had? We had a lot of Europeans move here. We had some Americans move here. We have Asians. What influence is it having on its place in this space of fintech, do you think, itself?
Yeah, well, there's two. The broader influence is just the fact that people have realized they don't need to be tethered to a location. They can actually freely move. Now, we're seeing the boomerang effect of, okay, if I just move somewhere else, you do lose something in connective tissue with the company, right? So put that aside. But it does mean people are moving and realizing that Zoom phone calls with periodic face-to-face interactions can work. I'd say in terms of Dubai and fintech, people have realized, and this is a growing trend, the pandemic has accelerated it. I don't think it's found it, but this growing trend that innovation is truly becoming global. And the other thing is this whole product market fit phenomena. People are realizing, yes, you can invest in Silicon Valley to the 53rd neobank that's there, but maybe there's a neobank targeted in the MENA region where there's no other competitors, and the product market fit actually is stronger. That is, I think, something that's fundamental that's happening in the pandemic. I think another reason is, in the US, there's so much capital, it's actually become oversaturated.
Oh, that's so still today.
Even more today, because last year 100 billion got raised, and that has to get spent. So I think there's some really good reasons in terms of Dubai and all these other centers not having their multiple unicorns, but still having a market need. But also that if you think about where people are going for investment returns, in the Bay Area may be great, but may not, because you could have great companies now become mediocre investments because they're overvalued.
Very interesting. Does Silicon Valley have a challenger, so to speak? Because it's got that innovation, it's got the education, it's got weight, as you're saying. There was a period of time it got extremely frothy. There were people put a 6-page PowerPoint and they could raise money.
Yeah.
Where are we in the life cycle of Silicon Valley, and who would be the '1 competitor out of curiosity, in your view?
I think it's unfair to everyone else because you could argue that Silicon Valley had a 50-year head start, right? Yeah. It really started in the 60s and 70s, so if you normalize it, I think it's a different discussion. I think that in the US, I think New England, New York, Southern California are doing really well. And in Europe, you also have this really great phenomenon, which I think can apply to Dubai, where the US is such a big market, it's sometimes you can almost think of it as a closed market because it's such a vast market. You have the East Coast, West Coast.
Yes.
In Europe, you have a lot of cross-cultural, cross-country flow, right? That I think you can have here as well. So I do think there's parts of Europe, I'd say the UK, Germany, and the Nordics are probably some of the leading contenders. Certainly China has established itself as a powerhouse, but even within Asia, India, Singapore, Southeast Asia, Australia, a tiny country in the grand scheme of things, has produced two of the most successful venture-backed companies in the last decade. One on the enterprise side, Atlassian, and one on the consumer side, actually Canva and Atlassian, both on the enterprise side.
Good. In the last 2 minutes that we have here, I'd love to get your thoughts on your impressions here. They're wrapping up Expo 2020. They had to hold it, basically 2 years later than they intended. You've been here before.
I have.
How much has it changed since the last time you came here?
It has changed a lot. So I've been coming here for probably a decade, 10, 12 years. It's been a few years, obviously pre-pandemic, maybe 4 or 5 years. And it's definitely changed. I don't remember Expo existing then. I'm sure it was there. But I would just, what is pretty amazing is just this embracing of disruption, of change, of broadening, of meeting a lot of great companies that are based in Dubai this week when I'm here, and just the mentality. And it's not used to be more consumer plays, but I'm seeing fintech companies, enterprise companies. So there's a breadth also that's really nice to see. So I think that you need that to get well on its way, to not just have one soup, but have 20 of those companies populating it, which really puts it on the map.